I stood frozen in front of the altar, while the incense smoke still lingered before the sharp clicking of high heels against the hardwood floor echoed through the hallway like a deliberate challenge. My name is Greta, and at 32 years old, I believed my marriage was a sanctuary of mutual respect, until the very foundation of my life crumbled in a single afternoon. Today was the first anniversary of my mother's passing, a day meant for quiet reflection in our family home in Boulder, yet the silence was shattered by the man I once trusted. My husband Preston strode into the living room with a smug expression while clutching the waist of a younger woman named Kinsley, who looked around the room with predatory eyes. Without a hint of remorse, Preston tossed a folder of legal documents onto the coffee table and declared that the house no longer belonged to me because he had officially transferred the title to his mistress. Kinsley began wandering through the room while running her fingers over my mother's antique vases and mocking the traditional decorations I had carefully prepared for the memorial service. She turned to the two security guards standing by the door and ordered them to clear out the trash, immediately pointing directly at the precious mementos that were all I had left of my family history. Preston stepped forward with a cold gaze and barked his ultimatum with absolute indifference to my grief. This house belongs to her now, so you need to pack your things and get out before I have the guards forcibly remove you from the premises. Instead of screaming or begging for mercy, I slowly placed the last incense stick into the burner and turned to look directly into his eyes with a calm, mysterious smile that seemed to catch him off guard. I walked toward the door while pausing just long enough to whisper that he had officially crossed the only line I ever drew, and he would soon realize that some debts are paid in ways he could never imagine. If you want to see how Greta reclaims her justice and dismantles the empire of the man who betrayed her, make sure to hit the subscribe button and follow this intense journey of ultimate revenge. The freezing wind from the Rockies whipped against my face as I walked down the sidewalk with the single suitcase containing the remnants of a shattered marriage. Each heavy step on the asphalt served as a bitter reminder of the 5 years I sacrificed to build a foundation for Preston's skyrocketing career. When we first married, he possessed nothing but unfinished blueprints and a hollow ambition to dominate the construction industry in Colorado. I did not hesitate to withdraw every penny of my hard-earned savings from my years in finance to fund my husband's struggling firm. Throughout that time, I functioned as both a devoted wife and a strategic consultant who navigated his business through its most treacherous periods of debt. Now that he stood at the pinnacle of success, he seemed perfectly willing to discard me like an obsolete tool that had finally outlived its usefulness. The transformation in Preston became truly disgusting after his older sister moved to the city to establish her own legal practice. My sister-in-law Beatrix was a sharp but manipulative lawyer who constantly viewed me with disdain because she felt I was beneath their family's newfound status. Beatrix frequently utilized complex legal jargon to intimidate me, while pressuring me to sign various documents that waived my rights to our shared marital assets. She whispered poison into her brother's ear by claiming I was merely a parasite, clinging to the wealth that their family had supposedly created alone. Preston gradually succumbed to her toxic influence until he genuinely believed his current achievements were solely the result of his individual genius. Heated arguments became a daily occurrence as he began openly flaunting expensive vacations with Kinsley right in front of me without a shred of remorse. Exhausted and left with nowhere to turn in the dead of the winter night, I sought refuge at the home of my best friend Mabel for some temporary shelter. Mabel greeted me with a warm embrace and a deep sense of empathy that finally allowed my suppressed tears to flow freely after a long day of humiliation. She cared for me with genuine kindness while patiently listening to the mountain of grievances I had endured within the cold walls of Preston's mansion. Mabel looked me directly in the eyes and insisted that I should never give up or surrender to the blatant injustice these people had forced upon me. She reminded me of a crucial detail I had accidentally overlooked during my years of mindless sacrifice for a blind and ungrateful marriage. Mabel knew very well that my mother had secretly left behind a hidden will in Boulder that Preston had never been able to discover or exploit. In the quiet sanctuary of her small living room, I began to recall the final instructions my mother gave me regarding an important iron box stored at the bank. Mom emphasized that this box should only be opened when I reached a dead end and had absolutely no one left to trust in this world. The box was registered exclusively under my name at the Central Bank of downtown Boulder to ensure absolute security against any prying eyes from outside the family. I realized I had been incredibly naive to think that sincerity could ever reform greedy and selfish individuals like the siblings Preston and Beatrix. His decision to label me a parasite was actually just a pathetic excuse to mask his cowardice and his secret ambition to seize my mother's legacy for himself. Mabel vowed to support me emotionally so that I would have the strength to begin the journey of reclaiming what rightfully belonged to me by law. I gripped the old key tightly in my coat pocket and felt a new surge of power rising from the depths of a soul that had suffered far too much. 4 weeks have passed since the night I was kicked out of my home, and I stand in front of the glass bank building with the old key clutched in my palm. Entering the private vault felt like stepping into a different reality, where the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and cold metal. I requested a meeting with a man I had only heard of through my mother's private letters who was waiting for me in a secure office. My lawyer Arthur greeted me with a professional nod while placing a thick stack of legal folders on the mahogany desk between us. As we opened the iron box together, I was completely stunned to see a massive portfolio of anonymous real estate holdings that my mother had managed to keep hidden for decades. Arthur explained that she had been quietly investing in the most prime commercial lands across the state of Colorado since long before I was even born. My mother was far more than a simple housewife because she possessed a brilliant mind for long-term wealth accumulation that neither Preston nor I ever suspected. Arthur pointed to the maps and deeds which proved that our family actually owned the ground beneath some of the busiest shopping centers in downtown Boulder. This revelation provided me with the sudden financial leverage I needed to transition from a victim into a silent predator. I immediately decided to establish a new private investment fund under a neutral corporate name to begin my strategic counterattack. I leaned across the desk and gave Arthur a very specific set of instructions that would mark the beginning of the end for my former husband's career. Arthur, I want you to buy up every single debt belonging to Preston's company and do not leave even 1 cent behind. Arthur adjusted his glasses while reviewing the aggressive acquisition strategy I had just laid out before him. Madam, doing this will leave him completely penniless in less than a year, he replied with a faint but knowing smile. The timing of this discovery was perfect because Preston was currently making the biggest mistake of his professional life. Under the constant and greedy prodding of Kinsley, he had decided to take out high-interest loans to fund a risky luxury hotel project. Preston was so desperate to prove his status to the high society of Boulder that he ignored every basic rule of financial risk management. He believed that his temporary success was permanent, while failing to see that his entire empire was built on a foundation of borrowed money and lies. I spent hours with Arthur analyzing the red ink financial reports that showed Preston's firm was bleeding cash while he was busy flaunting a fake lifestyle on social media. It was almost comical to see his photos of expensive champagne and designer suits, while I held the literal documents that could bankrupt him at any moment. Preston had grown arrogant enough to think he was untouchable because he assumed I was still struggling to find a place to sleep. He was so focused on Kinsley's demands for jewelry and luxury travel that he never noticed the subtle shifts in his company's debt ownership. Every time he signed a new credit agreement to keep his hotel project alive, he was unknowingly handing me more power over his future. Arthur confirmed that we now controlled over 60% of Preston's outstanding liabilities through various shell companies that were impossible to trace back to me. The trap was now set, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to pull the strings and watch his world collapse. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction knowing that the man who insulted my mother's memory would soon have to beg for mercy from the woman he discarded. 6 months later, as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, rumors of a mysterious investor taking over the Boulder market spread like wildfire through the local business community. Preston fell deep into my trap when several of his major partners abruptly withdrew their capital due to the growing uncertainty surrounding his flagship hotel project. Facing a sudden liquidity crisis, he felt he had no choice but to mortgage my mother's old villa to maintain the construction schedule. Beatrix tried to intervene by searching for legal loopholes in the mortgage agreements, yet she had no idea that Arthur had already stayed one step ahead by perfecting the foreclosure rights. My lawyer had meticulously restructured the debt terms so that the moment Preston missed a single payment, the property would legally revert to our control. While Preston struggled with his collapsing finances, Kinsley began to lose her mind and started placing immense pressure on him for things he could no longer afford. She was used to a life of endless luxury and became hysterical when Preston informed her that he had to cut back on her designer shopping sprees. Their relationship turned toxic as Kinsley cared more about her social standing than her partner's impending bankruptcy. I followed every development quietly through Mabel, who continued to act as a neutral intermediary while providing me with internal details about Preston's growing desperation. Mabel described how Preston would pace his office for hours while drinking heavily and wondering why his luck had suddenly vanished. Preston is going crazy because the project is stalled, and he actually believes some billionaire out there is coming to save him, Mabel told me during our secret meeting. I looked out the window at the snowy mountains and replied that he had no idea the billionaire was actually the wife he once discarded. The tension reached a boiling point during a private board meeting where Preston received the formal notice that a single creditor had consolidated his entire company debt. He sat at the head of the mahogany table with a pale face while realizing that his professional life now belonged to a complete stranger. Beatrix stood by his side trying to offer legal advice, but even her sharp mind could not find a way out of the ironclad contracts we had drafted. Preston looked around the room at his silent board members, who were already preparing to jump ship before the final collapse. He was still arrogant enough to believe he could negotiate his way out of this disaster if he could just meet the mysterious owner of the debt. While he was drowning in anxiety, I was in my new office preparing my attire and the final legal papers for the upcoming asset auction. I chose a sleek black suit that mirrored the cold determination in my heart as I gathered the documents that would officially end Preston's reign in Boulder. Everything was now in place for the public humiliation that would soon follow at the bank's gala event. Preston had spent years building a reputation based on my hard work and my mother's legacy, but he was about to lose it all in front of the very people he tried to impress. Arthur confirmed that the foreclosure notice had been served, and the countdown to the auction had officially begun. I felt no pity for the man who had shown me none when he threw me out onto the street on the anniversary of my mother's death. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the city in a blanket of white that seemed to symbolize the fresh start I was creating for myself. I gripped the leather folder containing the deeds to Preston's properties and knew that the time for silence was almost over. The lights of the charity gala in downtown Boulder shone brightly, but for Preston, this was the final gamble to save his crumbling career. He had organized this lavish event to search for new investors while desperately trying to hide the fact that he stood on the brink of total bankruptcy. Preston moved through the crowd with a forced smile while sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool air of the ballroom. He hoped that the display of wealth and influence would distract the local elite from the rumors of his failed hotel project and mounting corporate debts. By his side, Kinsley appeared completely arrogant in her most expensive designer dress, while she openly declared that Greta was merely an outdated chapter in Preston's life. She laughed loudly with a group of socialites and mocked the idea that an ex-wife could ever compete with her current status or beauty. Kinsley had no idea that the luxury she was flaunting was actually bought with money that Preston no longer legally possessed. The atmosphere in the grand hall changed instantly when the bank representative stepped onto the stage to make a highly anticipated announcement. A sudden silence blanketed the entire room as he informed the guests that the new owner of the villa and the construction company had just arrived at the entrance. Preston froze in place with a look of confusion because he had expected a faceless corporation or an elderly billionaire to step through those doors. Outside the glass entrance, a sleek black limousine came to a halt, while the valet opened the door for a mysterious figure who moved with absolute confidence. I stepped into the foyer wearing a high-end designer suit and carrying a presence of a true businesswoman that made me nearly unrecognizable to the crowd. My posture was straight, and my gaze was steady as I walked across the marble floor toward the man who had discarded me 6 months ago. Preston stared blankly at me with wide eyes while his glass nearly slipped from his trembling hand because he could not believe his eyes. The powerful woman standing before him in the center of the ballroom was a world away from the grieving and penniless Greta he had kicked out of his house. Kinsley's smirk vanished instantly as she realized that the crowd was now whispering about my sudden and dramatic transformation. Preston stumbled forward a few steps while his voice cracked with a mixture of shock and lingering arrogance. "Greta, what are you doing here in this outfit?" he asked while looking at me as if I were a ghost that had come to haunt his desperate celebration. I did not flinch or raise my voice, but looked him directly in the eye with a calm and chilling smile that silenced everyone around us. "I have come to inspect my new property, Preston," I replied while my voice echoed clearly through the silent hall for every investor to hear. The surrounding guests began to murmur as the reality of the situation started to sink in for Preston and his inner circle. He looked at Arthur, who was standing right behind me with a briefcase full of legal deeds that bore my signature as the primary owner. Beatrix tried to push through the crowd to offer a legal defense, yet she stopped when she saw the official bank seals on the documents I held. Preston realized in that moment that every loan he had taken and every asset he had mortgaged now rested in my hands. His face turned a ghostly shade of white, while the socialites who had just been laughing with Kinsley began to distance themselves from the failing couple. I felt a profound sense of justice as I stood in the heart of Boulder, no longer a victim, but the architect of my own triumph over those who tried to destroy me. 10 minutes after I stepped into the center of the banquet hall, the music was abruptly cut off to make way for the fateful sentence I had prepared for them. Arthur walked onto the stage with a calm authority while holding a set of official court orders that signaled the immediate foreclosure of the entire construction company and the family villa. The crowd fell into a shocked silence as my lawyer began reading the legal declaration that stripped Preston of every asset he had ever claimed as his own. While the guests whispered in disbelief, I stepped forward to present the most damning evidence of all regarding the illegal activities of his sister. I held up the forensic reports proving that Beatrix had forged my signature in the past to illegally transfer my mother's private properties into Preston's name. This revelation sent a wave of visible panic through Beatrix as she realized her prestigious legal career would end instantly due to this massive violation of professional ethics and state law. Beatrix tried to shout a denial, but her voice failed her when she saw the original documents with the time-stamped discrepancies that Arthur had uncovered from the bank archives. She looked around the room for support, only to find that the very colleagues she had once looked down upon were now staring at her with pure disgust. Nearby, Kinsley's face twisted with rage, and she immediately turned to insult Preston the moment she saw he was truly penniless. She realized her dream of a luxury life was vanishing, so she desperately tried to approach other wealthy investors in the room, only to be blocked by my security team. Kinsley began a loud and embarrassing scene until the guards firmly escorted her toward the exit to prevent any further disruption of the proceedings. Preston stood frozen in the middle of the hall while watching his sister crumble and his mistress abandon him in his darkest hour of need. The situation became even more dire for him as 3 officers from the Colorado State Police appeared at the entrance, following a request from Arthur's office. They marched through the parting crowd with a sense of purpose, while Preston's face turned an ashen shade of gray from the sheer terror of what was coming next. The lead officer informed Preston that he was being placed under arrest for systemic tax fraud and the illegal misappropriation of assets from a protected will. Preston began to tremble and reached out a hand toward me, while his eyes filled with a desperate plea for a mercy he never earned. "Greta, please think about this. We were once husband and wife, after all," he cried out while the officers moved to secure his hands in metal cuffs. I looked him directly in the eyes without a single flicker of emotion and told him that the police were waiting outside, and I hoped he liked his new room for the next 10 years. As the officers led him away, I reached out and took back the original keys to my mother's villa from the trembling hands of his former assistant. I stood at the center of the stage and requested that all the remaining traitors and accomplices leave my property immediately because their presence was no longer tolerated. The hall cleared out quickly as people scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal that had just destroyed the city's most arrogant couple. I stood alone in the quiet ballroom while holding the cold metal of the keys and feeling the heavy weight of the past finally lift from my shoulders. The justice I had sought for months was finally complete, and the legacy my mother worked so hard to build was safely back in my hands where it belonged. 1 week after that financial earthquake, I returned to my mother's house where the memories had finally been cleansed from the filth of others. The familiar wooden door opened to welcome me with a warm scent of sandalwood and the profound silence I had craved for so long. Preston was officially sentenced to prison after a swift trial filled with undeniable evidence regarding his long history of systemic financial fraud. His remaining assets were being liquidated by the authorities to compensate the dozens of innocent investors he had deceived over the past several years. He entered his prison cell with empty hands and a heart full of late regrets for everything he had so arrogantly thrown away. The brilliant career he once took pride in building on a foundation of lies was now nothing more than a ruined pile of debris in the eyes of the public. The punishment for Beatrix was equally severe, as she was officially disbarred for life by the Professional Ethics Committee for her role in the forgery. She did not just lose her reputation, but also faced a mountain of lawsuits for honor and property damages from her own former victims. Beatrix had used the law as a sharp weapon to suppress the weak, yet she now found herself being mercilessly discarded by the very system she manipulated. Meanwhile, Kinsley was evicted from her luxury apartment immediately because there was no one left to pay the expensive monthly service fees she demanded. She was forced to return to her impoverished hometown with nothing after all her high society connections turned their backs on her. Kinsley realized that designer labels could never hide the hollow nature of her soul once the money to maintain her fake aura vanished. I decided to use the majority of the funds recovered from my mother's investments to establish an educational foundation in her name within downtown Boulder. This foundation would focus on supporting and protecting women who were betrayed in marriage or faced legal difficulties similar to my own past struggles. I wanted to transform the immense pain I had endured into a positive resource to help the community and honor the valuable legacy my mother left behind. Mabel walked beside me on that quiet afternoon, and we lit a solemn stick of incense before my mother's portrait in the peaceful atmosphere of the house. We stood there in absolute stillness as the shadows of my enemies had finally been cleared from this sacred space once and for all. Mabel squeezed my hand and smiled to congratulate me on the true freedom I had earned through so many tears and consistent determination. "We did it, Mom. This house is truly peaceful now." I whispered toward the portrait while feeling a cool breeze blow through the open window. I turned to look at my most loyal friend and expressed my deepest gratitude because she had always believed in me during my moments of absolute despair. Thank you for always believing in me, Mabel, because I could not have stood firm until this day without your constant support. I said with a sincerity that was evident in every single word. I realized that the best revenge was not violence or blind hatred, but living a brilliant life and reclaiming everything that belonged to justice. This stormy journey had finally ended, but it opened a bright new chapter where I was completely the master of my own destiny. I stepped out onto the balcony to look toward the Rockies and smiled, because I knew I had finally found my way home after years of being lost. This morning, the sun rose behind the snow-capped mountains as I stood on the balcony of my old villa and felt a sense of true freedom. The crisp Colorado air filled my lungs while I realized that the heavy weight of the past 7 years had finally vanished into the winter horizon. I have officially begun my new journey as a powerful investor who is no longer a shadow of anyone else, but the master of my own destiny. My portfolio has expanded far beyond the original inheritance because I have learned how to navigate the complex world of commercial real estate with precision and courage. While I enjoy my success, I often think about Preston sitting in his cold prison cell and realizing that his greed and disregard for a loyal wife caused him to lose everything precious. He destroyed his own future by trading a lifetime of genuine support for the hollow promises of a mistress who abandoned him the moment the money ran out. The total collapse of Preston's family has become a sharp cautionary tale for the business community in Boulder regarding the vital importance of honesty and gratitude in life. Many local entrepreneurs now discuss his downfall as a reminder that a reputation built on sand will never survive the inevitable storms of the financial market. I spend my quiet mornings caring for my mother's garden, where I find the inner peace and strength needed to continue helping the local community of women. My foundation has already provided legal and financial aid to dozens of individuals who were left vulnerable by broken marriages and professional betrayal. These women look to me as a symbol of hope because I proved that it is possible to rebuild a life from the ashes of humiliation. Every flower I plant in this soil serves as a living tribute to the woman who gave me the tools to reclaim my dignity and my wealth. The story of my survival has reached its final conclusion with a sense of balance and justice that few people ever get to experience in their lifetime. I watched the sunrise reach its peak before walking back inside to prepare for the next chapter of my expanding professional career. I put on my tailored suit and gathered my documents while reflecting on how much I have grown since the night I was thrown out with only one suitcase. My car arrived at the front gate and I stepped into the black limousine to head toward a ceremony for signing a major new contract. I felt radiant and stronger than ever before as the vehicle moved smoothly toward the city center where my future awaited me with open arms. The journey from a discarded wife to a respected leader is now complete, and I am ready to face any challenge that comes my way. The story of Greta serves as a powerful reminder that women should never give up their financial independence or their self-respect under any circumstances. In life, money can always be earned back through hard work and strategy, but character and trust can never be recovered once they are truly lost. You must always maintain a solid backup plan for yourself because the only person who will never betray you is yourself and your own capabilities. Do not let anyone convince you that your worth is tied to your relationship status or the approval of a selfish partner who does not value your contributions. True power comes from knowing that you can stand on your own 2 feet, regardless of the obstacles that others place in your path. Sincere thanks to all of you for listening to the story of Greta's resilience until the very final moments. We truly appreciate your companionship throughout this emotional journey of justice and transformation. Please do not forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how Greta handled her situation and the lessons you have learned from her experience. Your opinions are always the motivation for us to develop more meaningful content in the future.
Trước khi khép lại câu chuyện ngày hôm nay của Greta, tôi muốn các bạn đừng vội rời đi mà cùng tôi chiêm nghiệm lại những gì chúng ta vừa theo dõi. Thực ra, hành động của Preston hay Beatrix không chỉ là sự phản bội hôn nhân mà là còn sự băng hoại về đạo đức khi chà đạp lên linh hồn của người đã khuất. Quan điểm của tôi là phụ nữ dù có yêu thương đến đâu cũng không được đánh mất chính mình và sự độc lập tài chính. Lòng tốt không có răng nanh chính là sự dung túng cho kẻ ác. Greta đã chọn cách im lặng để kiến tạo một đế chế, dùng sự thành công rực rỡ làm đòn trừng phạt tàn khốc và tàn ác nhất cho những kẻ coi thường mình.